strictly for the Model Boat Club, although I'm sure I will probably stick it on my Facebook page or whatever. This is my model boat building magnum opus, and I'm sure you're all very impressed that I can speak Latin, maybe slightly impressed that I could build a boat this big. This is the French battleship Richelieu. This project is it hasn't been entirely successful, but it's not a failure. It's a little bit in limbo. I started building this many years ago, and it's 102 inches long, and that brings with it some special problems, and I will detail them for those of you that are interested. The plans for it actually came from Poland, and they were for a 1/100th scale boat, and I wanted to build it in 1/96th scale, which is more common in North America. So I had to do a little mathematics, which I'm not normally very good at, but when it comes to models, I can sort of figure it out. So this, like I said, it's 102 inches long. As it sits, it weighs about 70 some odd pounds. And I'll be perfectly honest with you, I wasn't entirely thrilled that I started this. I actually started this video. I don't know if it was a good idea pulling this out of storage, because it was a lot heavier than I thought. And I guess I'm a little older than I imagined myself to be. One neat feature, though, I have to show you while we've got, the wide-angle view here, is because it's so long, the obvious question is, how do you move it? How do you move something that's 102 inches long? Because I had a model submarine that was 90 inches long. When I used to take that to the pond, I would have to stick the bow into the passenger footwell of the car, put the seats down, and then you'd have the propeller sticking out the back end of the car, and that was 90 inches long. This is a foot longer. So, how do you move it? And right from the beginning, I knew I had to do something special, and I'm going to demonstrate that now. And here it is. And hopefully it won't be too difficult. There we go. The boat, as you can see, breaks into two halves. Not easily, obviously, which is good. I guess you don't want it falling apart easily. But it's divided into two halves. And I think the front half's about 55 inches long. And this is what, this would be about 47 inches long. Two halves bolted together. And that will actually fit across the back seat of a car. So that's the special feature. That's what makes it possible to move this ship. What I will, and I'll explain as long as I've got it apart here. The battery compartment goes in the front end. The back end's got all the running gear. And about the first 40 inches of the boat, of the bow, is expanded polyurethane foam. So it's, I don't want to say unsinkable, but it can take a lot of damage because you can poke a hole through it and water's not going to leak into it. The guts are at the back end, and this is not surprising. This is where I've had a lot of issues. But what I will do now is I'm going to move around. I'll bring the camera over and we can get some detail on some of the interesting bits. Okay, this is the joint, and as you can see, it's keyed so that this male part will fit into the female section, gets it lined up perfectly, and it's held together by 4 bolts. The question being, well, how do you know it's not going to leak? As you can see, only 2 of these bolts are actually below the water line. So they're the only ones that are actually exposed to water. Now in the rear section of the hull, these are blind holes. They go into a compartment that is filled with lead and epoxy. So water can't leak into that. Even if I was to put this in water without bolts in there, there's no place for the water to go. So like I say, it can't leak here. the upper bolts can't leak, they're above the water line. The lower bolts here can't leak because they go into they're blind holes going into a compartment packed with epoxy and lead, so there's no place for it to leak to. On the front half, again, the holes here are above water, that's not a problem. Now, the lower holes, they are below the water line, so they could theoretically leak. That's not really an issue for two reasons. I put the bolts in there. They're heavy bolts. I think they're I think 3/16 half-inch bolts, somewhere thereabouts. But I use gaskets coated with grease when I put them in there, so the water can't really leak. Realistically, it can't. You could get a few drops, but realistically, there's not going to be a leak. But again, even worst case scenario, let's suppose that water actually was able to get through here. Let's suppose I forgot to put the bolts in, you know, worst case scenario, I forgot to put the bolts in and it's open to the water. Well, the front section, as I mentioned, I've actually sealed the front section. The front section is full mostly with foam, and that foam is behind a plywood bulkhead. So this front section, there's only about that much of it is actually open. There's a big battery compartment in here. So even if water was to free flood in here, that section of boat is only about that long, and it could only, get about that deep because of all the structure in here. So at worst, this could probably take on about 10 pounds of water. And that's, I can't actually, honestly, I can't imagine it being that much. Maybe even 5 pounds would be the maximum. That's simply not going to affect a boat this big. This is, when this thing is in the water, this would be over 100 pounds. So again, there's actually no way that a leak could possibly affect this. So it's a minor consideration. So that's the joint. And what I'll do is I'll bring the camera around. I'll show you a few other features of the boat. Now this is the front section of the boat. As you can notice here, there's raised coaming so that when the superstructure goes on, again, it'll give it a little bit of a water break there. And if you look deep inside, you can see there's one of the holes where the bolts go through to hold the two halves together. This is where the battery sits, right here. And if you go just inside, there's a solid bulkhead in there. So again, it's only open up to about here. So there's a relatively small compartment here. And the only operating really part of the boat, or the only equipment housed in this forward section, is the battery. All the working gear is in the rear section. Here's the basic running gear that you'll see from the outside. It's got one rudder. One very, very large rudder. I think that's about 4.5 inches long that way. It has 4 propellers, brass propellers. They're 4-bladed, and they are each 1 3/4 inches in diameter. Here's the steering gear, which is really a model airplane setup in many ways. Big servo there. In the old days we used to call that a quarter scale servo. I don't know if they still use that terminology. And this is the kind of arrangement that you would see to steer a nose wheel on a model airplane. And the rudder shaft I'm using there is actually a 3/16 steel shaft that would normally be used for propeller, boat propeller. So it's quite a heavy-duty setup. Well, this is the running gear from the inside. And not surprisingly, this is where I've had really my issues. It has 4 Pitman 12-volt motors. These are sold by Dumas under their own brand name, so you'll know them as Dumas motors or Pitmans. They're the same thing. Real nice motors. The problem really is that the shafts on this boat are very, very long. These extremely long shafts. and it's hard to keep them from whipping around. You want to make sure that they're running steadily and evenly, through the center of the shaft. So I actually built some braces in there to try to hold them, just to make sure that the ends wouldn't flap around a bit. But it's been very difficult. I've had a lot of trouble getting the motors to run, at similar speeds. So it always seems to be one takes off a little bit, and some are run a little bit rough, and some will flap around. So I haven't quite got this figured out, and this is where the problem has been. Now, I have to tell you, I think I might be able to tackle this today. I started this project a very, very long time ago when I was half decent at woodwork, but really didn't have a lot of machining equipment or machining skill. I've got more of that gear now, so I think this is a problem. I think this is a problem I can tackle. I think there's parts that I understand now how to replace that I didn't know how to replace back then. And there's more about the geometry that I understand now. So I think this is a fixable problem. But it has been a disappointment that it didn't run perfectly first time out. It's something I've had to deal with. But it is fixable. So this is a future project. I don't know when I'll get around to finishing it off. It's one of those things that once you get going on it, it seems like a good idea, but eventually you run out of steam. Another thing I will point out, though, while I have the boat open here is, of course, it's completely fiberglassed on the outside, but it's also 100% fiberglassed on the inside, and not just coated with resin. There's fiberglass cloth in every single compartment. Every single square inch of this boat is fiberglassed inside and out with fiberglass cloth and epoxy. So again, if any oil or water leaks in, it's not going to damage the boat, and that's the way I like to build things. So that's kind of the current state of the project. It's an impressive project. My progress hasn't been that impressive, but it's quite the thing to see.